Well, guys, if you're thinking, wait a second, this is week 4 of challenge and we've been in 3 different rooms. What are we doing next week? We will be here next week. So don't worry. We will be here, God willing, the rest of this semester, so you don't have to worry about that. So hopefully we'll have a little less rain. I first of all, I wanted to thank, if you're part of the setup team, Joey and the rest of the band, can you guys raise your hands? Because they brave doing all this stuff in the rain, so thanks for doing that. I've done that many times, and it's not fun. It's not fun in general, but it's definitely not fun in the rain. So thanks for doing that, guys. And we also have some guests with us tonight. So Scott and Carmela and some students from Japan. If you guys want to raise your hands, I want to see. There you are. You're in the back there. All right. If you think you had to travel far to come to Challenge tonight, they have you beat. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't gotten to meet them yet, go back and meet them. Scott and Carmela teach at a university there in Japan, and the students are part of their university. And so they're here for about 2 weeks total. And so we're excited to be able to get to know them and share some time with them. So this week we are kicking off a new series. It's going to be a 3-week series. I'm really excited for this series. It's called Wisdom for Life, Lessons from the Book of Proverbs. And just as a show of hands, how many of you guys have read through like the entire book of Proverbs? Who's read the entire book? Okay, so there's a decent amount, and a decent amount that haven't. That's to be expected. Well, I hope after tonight, one of the things that this will encourage you, if you've read through before, or if you haven't, that after tonight in the series, that this would really encourage you to want to begin to read and to dig into the book of Proverbs more and more for yourself. There's so much richness. There's so many just nuggets of truth that's chock full of insights. But we have to mine for them. For me personally, there's just been many godly men and women that I look up to that one of the reasons they're the godly men and women they are is because they've really taken a lot of time to delve into this particular book of the Bible and to really not only learn it, but you can apply the truths of it from their lives. For instance, Kent Humphreys, he was a multi-millionaire businessman before he passed away. He was a good friend of mine, a mentor. One of the things that he used to do is he would take the book of Proverbs and he would have it individually bound and send it out as Christmas gifts to his different suppliers and his different coworkers and people in industry around the world. He sent around at Christmas time and he'd say, guys, this is the best book on finances I've ever read. And you can get an MBA in finances if you read this book. I encourage you to read it. And so he would do stuff like that. My dad, who started Christian Challenge here back in 1988, he didn't become a Christian really till he was about close to some of you guys' age, really in his late teens. He didn't grow up in a Christian home. And so when he got to college, he, maybe for some of you guys feel the same way, he kind of felt a little behind, so to speak, when it came to just understanding what it looked like to walk with God in different areas. He got around some of these guys who had grown up in Christian homes, and they just seemed to have more understanding about life and scriptures and things like that. So he just felt a little behind. And so one of the things he decided to do is he took about a whole year in college where he just read through Proverbs over and over and over and over again because he realized that seems to be a book that a lot of wise people know. Maybe I should read that. And so that was a very just profitable year for him that he references back to years and years later. And then, for myself, I don't know about you, but when I was younger, I used to kind of think like life was this complicated and I was this competent. And so I was fine. And then as I got older and got into college, I realized, no, actually life is this complicated and I'm this competent. So there is a gap. I'm just on the underside of that gap. And so when I got to college, I had read Proverbs some before, but it really wasn't until the summer after my freshman year of college that I really began to kind of dive into Proverbs even more. I was a part of this training program called Project Impact in Chicago. And so I just would read Proverbs and study and look at all different parts of it. And I memorized a couple of verses from it every week because the great thing about Proverbs is the sentences are short and sweet, so you feel awesome. I memorized 2 verses. And it was like 5 words. It was awesome. But hey, that's great. And one of the verses I memorized, which was kind of funny, was says, "Wisdom will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones." And that summer, I was living in a one-bedroom apartment with 5 guys, and I drew the short straw and somehow got the mattress on the ground tucked in between 2 other bunk beds, and it was next to the dresser, so everyone had to step on my bed with their dirty, sweaty feet to get to the dresser. And like, we had no air conditioning. I would just sweat myself to sleep every night. Like, there had to be things growing in that room. And yet, I never got sick all summer. Now, I'm just saying, wisdom brings health to your body and nourishment to your bones. I don't know if that's coincidence or not, but I spent that summer studying Proverbs. I never got sick, and it's part of the gross environment I lived in up to that point. So, needless to say, Proverbs is really good. Now, the reason Proverbs is so helpful and time-tested over the years is it wasn't written by some random guy in his mom's basement who had a blog and he was just posting all sorts of things about, life lessons that he had never learned. That was not it. The reason it's so profitable and helpful is the person who wrote the majority of the book, was a man named Solomon. And he was the son of King David of Israel, and he himself was a king of Israel. And you have to read his story in the Old Testament. It's really amazing. But God blessed him such that he said, I'm going to make you the wisest person that's ever lived, short of myself. No, not me, but Jesus. And so he really is the wisest person that ever lived other than Jesus. And so, for someone like that to say, let me break you off some knowledge and stuff, like, that's a person worth listening to. And in the introduction of his book in Proverbs, he lays out lessons and reasons for why he wrote Proverbs and some of the benefits. And so I want us to read that, just kind of an introduction night. I really like the Message translation of this passage because it really helps us wrap our minds around sort of the vernacular better. So this is how it starts off. He says this: "These are the wise sayings of Solomon, David's son, Israel's king, written down so we'll know how to live well and right, to understand what life means and where it's going." And then he goes on and says, "It's a manual for living, for learning what's right and just and fair, to teach the inexperienced the ropes, and to give our young people a grasp on reality." Dallas Willard, who was a professor here at USC, he was a very godly professor, taught in the philosophy department. He passed away a number of years ago, but he used to say, reality is that thing you bump up against when you're wrong. Any of you guys ever, bump up against reality and go, oh, apparently that's not how life works in that category? Well, that's what that is. And then he goes on to say this, says, "There's something here also for seasoned men and women." That's a nice way of saying old people. And still a thing or two for the inexperienced to learn. Fresh wisdom to probe and penetrate, the rhymes and reasons of wise men and women. And then he finishes with this, he said, "Start with God. The first step in learning is bowing down to God. Only fools thumb their noses at such wisdom and learning." Now, if you've ever read the book of Proverbs much, while it has a lot of good things to say in it, you could probably attest that it's a little bit overwhelming to read, isn't it? I mean, you read it and it's lots of good stuff, but if you've never had ADD, you have it then, because you're like, what do I focus on? There's so many good things to read and to focus on when you're reading, and it's a little bit kind of like drinking from a fire hose. Now, one thing you can do that's helpful is, there's 31 chapters in the book of Proverbs, and most months, except for February and a few others, have 31 days. So you could read a chapter a day and basically work through the book of Proverbs once a month in addition to whatever else you're reading. But even then, even if you did that, which that's a good thing to do if you're starting off, it's still hard to kind of wrap your mind around all the things that are in Proverbs. Begin to wrap your mind on just the practical and the graspable level. So one thing that was really helpful for me when I was in college was a mentor friend of mine named Max Barnett. He began to teach me how he began to approach and study Proverbs. And one of the things he said he would do is he would do these topical studies of Proverbs. And basically what that would look like is he said, well, think of a question or think of a topic that you really want to get an answer to, a thing that you really are wanting to learn about, and then begin to trace that question or that topic through the book of Proverbs. And every time you come across a verse that deals with that topic, just notate that, write that down. And then once you've kind of combed through the whole book, then you have this list of verses that deal with that topic, and then begin to study those verses and begin to understand what they mean and begin to understand how they connect and correlate with the other verses in that topic. And at the end, you can begin to see some categories, some big ideas and summary thoughts about that particular topic. And that was really helpful for me. And there are so many topics that you can study out of the book of Proverbs. Here's just a list of them. Maybe you might even want to take a picture or write some of these down if you can't write them down fast enough, just to kind of get the juices flowing. You can learn about how to make good decisions. In Proverbs, you can learn about how to manage your time. You can learn about good and bad ways to handle your words. Hopefully you prefer the former than the latter. You can learn about how to guard your heart. You can learn about what it means to live wisely versus foolishly, how to be prudent, how to raise your kids, how to build a good culture in a city or a group or a company, how to deal with trouble or pain, how to be successful, how to manage and grow your finances, how to have a right value structure in life, and how to deal with lust or anger or laziness. And that's just scratching the surface. I mean, the list goes on. There's so many topics that you could kind of study and work through the book of Proverbs. And one of the things that you could do, and this is something we've done with students in the past that have done Project Impact in our summer training program, is once you kind of begin to study and figure all that out, is like, come up with like a 1 or 2 page summary of just some key takeaways, some key ideas, or maybe even make a little PowerPoint presentation and just kind of help you figure out what are the main things you're learning from that topic, and maybe begin to memorize some of those verses. For example, I've done this a number of times, but one time I studied time management through the book of Proverbs. That was an incredibly profitable study. And as I began to kind of work the thing, I'm gathering the verses, studying them, kind of seeing what the big categories are about time. My summary, and I didn't know what my summary was going to look like, but at the end, what it basically came down to is I came up with, here's top 10 ways to maximize your time and top 10 ways to waste your time, according to the book of Proverbs. And I'm still living out of the fruit and benefits of that study years later. So tonight, I want to just take one of these topics and begin to go through it. And I want us to be able to explore it, albeit it's not going to be exhaustive. We don't have time for that. But what does Proverbs have to say about living wisely versus living foolishly? Now, before we ever look at this topic, I can imagine if I was to ask everyone in this room, like, hey, would you rather be a fool or be wise? I don't think anyone is going to raise their hands. Oh, I'd rather be a fool. Yeah, definitely a fool. Like, no, I think everyone here is thinking, yeah, I want to be wise, of course. But the problem is, even though we want to be wise, we don't always live wisely, do we? And I think part of the problem is sometimes we don't understand and we forget the benefits of living wisely, if we even know what they are at all. And sometimes we forget and don't think about the consequences of living foolishly. And we also don't know, even if we want to live wisely, how do you go about living a wise life? And so tonight, what I want us to look at is begin to look at, okay, what are the benefits of living a wise life? What are some of them? And then begin to look at what are some of the consequences of living a foolish life? And then how do you go about getting on the path of wisdom? And as we go through this, one of the things I think you'll begin to notice as we talk about even some of the benefits and the consequences is you'll begin to notice some character traits begin to rise to the surface of wise people versus foolish people. Take note of that, because as you do, you want to take that and kind of begin to compare it to your life and say, which of those do I begin to look more like? I mean, I know I want to be wise and not a fool, but do I resemble any of the things in the foolish characteristics? And to what degree do I resemble the wise? How do I need to go about changing that? So we're going to jump in to talk about that, but because, it doesn't matter if you intend to live wisely. If you're acting foolishly, and Andy Stanley had a great line, he says, it is direction, not intention, that determines destination. And that's really true. It is the direction of your life, not the intention of where you want to go, that's really going to determine where you're going to go and where you're going to end up. Or for the purposes of our topic tonight, you could say something like this: to skip the path of fools, you must follow wisdom's rules. To skip the path of fools, you must follow wisdom's rules. And we're going to get to some of those rules in a bit, but before, we're going to talk about what are some of the benefits of living a wise life. Because, again, if you don't have a clear picture and a compelling vision of what a wise life, why that even be good and to work at, you're not going to move in that direction. So I have eight different benefits here we'll walk through here. Number one, wisdom really leads to a long life and peace. Wisdom leads to a long life and peace. One example of this you see in Proverbs 3:16 and 17 says, long life is in her right hand. This is speaking about personified wisdom. It says, long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. Another benefit is wisdom provides protection and security. Wisdom provides protection and security. Proverbs 4:6 says, Do not forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. Love her, and she will watch over you. Any guys ever worry about being safe? And the fact that you live in Los Angeles? I mean, there's a lot of people that honestly, they worry about that on a regular basis. But wisdom really can provide a lot of security, a lot of protection. Number 3, wisdom brings prosperity and success. Proverbs 18 and 19 says, with me, again, this is wisdom speaking, with me are riches and honor, enduring wealth and prosperity. My fruit is better than fine gold, and what I yield surpasses choice silver. Now, notice the value ranking Solomon gives there. Solomon was an incredibly wealthy man. And yet, he doesn't say that silver and gold aren't valuable. He just says their value really pales in comparison to gaining wisdom. And yet, guys, think about that for ourselves. How often do we trade opportunities to gain wisdom for opportunities to gain money? You're like, I would go to that, but here's an opportunity to make money. I would go to this, but here, but what Solomon is saying, again, probably way wiser and way wealthier than any of us are ever going to be. He says, guys, if you had to pick one, if they're ever at odds, pick gaining wisdom. That's far more valuable. Proverbs 24:3-4 says, by wisdom a house is built, or you could say a life. By wisdom a life is built, and through understanding it is established. Through knowledge its rooms are filled with rare and beautiful treasures. And then another benefit is wisdom guides you in righteous living. Wisdom guides you in righteous living. Proverbs 2:9-10 says, then you will understand what is right and just and fair, and every good path, for wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Much of the stuff in our heart is not very good stuff. I don't know about you, but that's true for me. And so that kind of cliche statement we hear basically in every Disney movie of follow your heart, that's just terrible advice, right? But if you begin to walk on the path of wisdom, you can begin to have some of that junk that's in your heart begin to get shoved out and replaced with wisdom. To over time, you begin to make better decisions. You begin to live rightly. Another benefit you see is wisdom gives you favor with God and people. In Proverbs 3:4, Solomon, he's talking about living a life that's of faithfulness and living a life of love, which are aspects of wisdom. And he says this, he says, then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and men. And in Proverbs 14:35, he says, a king delights in a wise servant, but a shameful servant arouses his fury. In our modern terms, what you could say is something like, a boss delights in a wise employee, but a shameful employee makes the boss want to fire him. It's another way of saying that. And I saw this verse play out when I used to work in business before I joined staff full time. And I would see guys and girls that went to kind of, no-name universities really begin to rise in the ranks at some of these companies. And I saw Harvard graduates getting fired because they couldn't handle relating to their boss well, and they couldn't handle their mouth. And they had an MBA from this school or that school. At the end of the day, when you're in the work environment, it really does not matter what school you went to. It matters how you work and relate to your boss and your employees. So I saw that one kind of play out in real time. And then number 6, another benefit is wisdom really helps you make good decisions. Proverbs 11:14 says, for lack of guidance, a nation falls, but victory is won through many advisors. Now, Proverbs 16:16 says, how much better to get wisdom than gold, to get insight rather than silver. So even Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived, except Jesus, said he even chose to surround himself with wise people. He didn't just go, well, I am the wisest man. I mean, after all, what else could anyone share with me? But no, he was wise enough to know, no, I need to surround myself with wise counsel. I need to regularly get input on decisions. So let me ask you, do you have any important decisions coming up in your life? And are you surrounding yourself with wise counsel and getting input on that? Or are you kind of just going, no, me and God, and me, we'll figure that out. If so, you might be moving along the path of a fool, not the path of a wise person. Something to think about. And then the 7th benefit, wisdom gives you strength. Wisdom gives you strength. Proverbs 24:5 says, the wise prevail through great power, and those who have knowledge muster their strength. There's something gritty and persevering about being wise. You just kind of learn to rally and move forward with the help of God. It's kind of like old man strength, right? You're not sure how an older guy does what he does, but it's like he still does it. And like I'm kind of in that cusp where I'm not old enough to have old man strength, but I don't really have my young man strength anymore. So I'm in the worst of both. But I'm hoping it kicks in one of these days. But you just begin to find a way. You find a way to do that. And Proverbs 21:22 says, one who is wise can go up against the city of the mighty and pull down the stronghold in which they trust. So, again, begin to ask yourself, are any of you guys feeling weak? Are you feeling weak, not just physically, but emotionally or spiritually or mentally? What Proverbs is saying is you can actually really get a lot of strength as you begin to move along the path of wisdom in all those areas. And then the eighth benefit, wisdom leads to a blessed life. Wisdom leads to a blessed life. Proverbs 3:13-14 says, blessed are those who find wisdom, those who gain understanding, for she is more profitable than silver and yields better returns than gold. Notice again the value ranking. Wisdom, it's not saying money is not important, it's just saying it's so much less valuable than gaining wisdom. Proverbs 8:35 says, for those who find me find life and receive favor from the Lord. If you ask most people around, if you ask them, and I'd probably say if I pulled this room and you said, man, what is it you really want to get out of life? Like, what's the goal? Like in some version or another, you'd probably say something like, I just want to be happy. That's what I want. And yet, so often we see so many people that are not happy. And the reason is they're going down so many paths of what they think is going to lead to happiness. And they find out it didn't lead to it. But what the wisest person who ever lived, except for Jesus, said here is, guys, you want a blessed life? You want a happy life? Go after wisdom. That is the pathway to a blessed life. That's the pathway to happiness. We could spend the rest of the night talking about, other benefits, but hopefully I think what you're beginning to see is there is a richness and there is a lot of just good things in store for people that walk along the path of the wise versus the foolish. Now, let's go on the other end. So what about foolishness? What are some of the consequences of living a foolish life according to the wisest man who ever lived, said Jesus? Well, one of the consequences you see is fools despise wisdom and knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and knowledge. Proverbs 1:7, one of the verses we read at the beginning, it says this, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. But fools despise wisdom and instruction. They despise it. They don't even see it as valuable. It's not cool. It's just like, wisdom, like that's so lame. But yet, it's incredibly valuable. And Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice. Now, don't raise your hand on this, but do you usually think your ways are right? Like, let's be honest. Like, how many of you think, no, I think I'm usually wrong most of the time? No, most ways you usually think, no, our ways are right. But the question is, what is that based on? Is that based on you've regularly got input and wise counsel on your ways and you really consulted the scriptures, and based on that, you say your ways are wise, or it's just like, no, I just kind of a gut feeling, after all, I kind of know better. I've lived 2 decades. I know how life works. It's like, and if we're being honest, that's how a lot of people are. It's just kind of this gut intuition. And yet, he says right here, guys, he says, the ways of a fool seems right to them. I think, whose ways don't seem right to them? It's like, well, a wise person goes, I might not have all the answers. I might want to get some input. And then a second thing to watch out for says, fools bring destruction upon themselves. Fools bring destruction upon themselves. Proverbs 10:8 says, the wise in heart accept commands, but a chattering fool comes to ruin. One of the characteristics of a fool is they're really quick to respond. Whenever they're given instruction or rebuke, they're quick to argue, they're quick to justify, they're quick to rationalize. No. And they're quick to figure out some way to communicate why what you just said doesn't apply to them and why they shouldn't have to do what you did and why really they're the exception to the rule. And then the result is the next verse. Proverbs 19:29, it says, penalties are prepared for mockers, and the beatings for the back of fools. Sadly, fools tend to not learn unless they really experience physical pain and loss of some kind. And they find themselves regularly enrolled in courses at the school of hard knocks because for whatever reason, they're hard-headed enough, they're stubborn enough, they think that's the only way they learn, But it doesn't have to be the case, but that's just what they do. Another consequence of the foolish life is fools speak recklessly and they cause conflict. Proverbs 18:2 says, fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions. Because after all, they're the smartest person in the room. Who wouldn't want to hear from the smartest person in the room? Proverbs 29:11 says, fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm to the end. Fools, one of their problems is they really lack self-control. They lack self-control, and they're constantly damaging their relationships with their actions, in part, but they're even more so damaging their relationships with their words and their emotions. You know anyone like that? That it's like, man, don't stand in front of them. You'll be in direct line of fire with their emotions or their words. And it's like, and sometimes the foolish person has no idea they're even doing it. They're just so used to doing it. They're blowing holes in everybody, and they're just like, why is everybody bleeding? I don't understand what's going on, Another consequence of foolish living is fools reject discipline and correction. Fools reject discipline and correction. Proverbs 15:5 says, a fool spurns a parent's discipline, but whoever heeds correction shows prudence. And then Proverbs 17:10 says, a rebuke impresses a discerning person more than 100 lashes a fool. Now, this last word, it's kind of funny, except it's just so sad, this image, the picture, but the idea is someone who has discernment, they are more easily persuaded by just a soft rebuke, a soft correction than a fool is. A fool has to be physically beaten into a pulp, and by about the 99th, beating, they're going, you're serious, aren't you? Or maybe this is actually something to consider. They're so thick-headed that they just think, no, my ways are better, but you've done that 80 times, and it's never worked out well for you. That's just bad luck. I'm going to do it this way again. And you're like, okay. And they act foolishly. But see, a wise person, a discerning person, they have much more of a sensitive and soft heart. Just a mild rebuke is enough for them to go, yeah, I probably should give some thought to that. Probably should give some correction to that. Another thing is fools are lazy and they suffer for it. Fools are lazy and they suffer for it. Proverbs 6:9-11 says, how long will you lie there, you sluggard? When will you get up from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, a little video games. No, I'm just joking. And poverty will come on you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man. Guys, there's nothing wrong with getting proper rest. Like, you ought to get proper rest. In fact, many of you guys probably are under-rested, and you probably need to get more rest. But you just have to watch out, is what he's saying here. It's that extra sleep. It's the extra little breaks. It's the extra little, I'll just play a little bit more of this, or I'll do a little more of that, or just I carve out just a little bit more me time. It begins to build, and if you're not careful, it can be a real slippery slope to destruction and poverty. There's not an exact formula for this at all, but you just begin to see some warnings in the scripture, some guidelines of here's some things to be aware of. And so I'd encourage you, begin to get in the scriptures, begin to get around wise people and ask them, hey, what is some guidelines around that area so that I'm making good choices around that. And then 6, fools lack self-control and are quick to anger. Proverbs 14:16-17 says, the wise fear the Lord and shun evil, but a fool is hot-headed and yet feels secure. No, not really clued into reality, are they? And then a quick-tempered person does foolish things, and the one who devises evil schemes is hated. And then Proverbs 20:3 says, it is to one's honor to avoid strife, but every fool is quick to quarrel. I remember the first time reading this verse, and we really began to think about it, and so I decided to memorize it. And this verse was a real paradigm shift for me as it came to conversations, because like a lot of you, I thought, well, I'm not necessarily wanting to argue, but, if I need to defend my reputation and my honor, I will get an argument and make sure I win, But what this verse is saying is actually, if you're interested in preserving your honor, you will do well not to get into arguments. That's actually better for your honor not to do that. And so since then, I've actually learned to argue a lot less. And then the last of the negative ramifications, there's a ton more, but again, for time's sake, fools trust in themselves instead of God. That's really where this all boils out of. Proverbs 28:26 says, those who trust in themselves are fools, but those who walk in wisdom are kept safe. Or Proverbs 14:12 says, there is a way that appears right, but in the end it leads to death. Again, it's like that Dallas Willard quote, reality is that thing you bump up against when you're wrong. Every fool wants a good life. Even if someone lives a foolish life, they're not, intentionally trying to ruin their life. Like they're really wanting to have a good life, and they're going down what appears, as this verse said, a good direction. It appears right to them, and they think the road they're headed is going straight to success. The problem is they don't realize it's about to go off a cliff. But in their minds, they're thinking, this is right. I don't know why everybody says, watch out, and then they go off the cliff. But oftentimes they won't know it until they're over the cliff. Again, we could go on and more about some of these different foolish characteristics, but I think what you begin to see is, there is a lot of destruction and shame and separation from any of God's blessings as you begin to walk down the path of the fool. So how do we avoid these foolish mindsets and actions, pursuits? Again, come back to what we said earlier. To skip the path of fools, you must follow wisdom's rules. So what are wisdom's rules? We've seen some of the benefits of wisdom and the consequences of foolishness, but how do we begin to get on the path of wisdom? And more importantly, how do we stay on the path of wisdom? So let me give you 5 rules that you see in the scriptures, particularly in Proverbs. Rule number 1, fear the Lord. Fear the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs 9:10 says, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Now, to fear the Lord does not mean you walk around just kind of shaking and scared of ever interacting with God and just like, oh, watch out, he's going to smack you at any point. Like, that's not what the fear of the Lord means. What it really means is you respect him enough that you really take seriously what he says. That's really what the idea of the fear of the Lord means. It's kind of like my kids with my wife and I. Most of the time, not all the time, they have a healthy fear of us. And because they do, they really stay within the boundaries of what we say is good for them to do and what is not good for them to do. And we tell them to go do something, they do it. And when we tell them, hey, that's not good to do, they choose not to do it because they both trust that we know what we're talking about, and they know and they trust that when we say, if you do that, there's going to be consequences. They know we're going to make good on those consequences, And so not because we're trying to be mean, but because we love them. And so they learn to have a healthy fear of their mom and dad and saying, when they say something, I should probably take them seriously because they might know what they're talking about and they have the power to back up what they're saying. So first rule, fear the Lord. That's the beginning. The second is choose humility. Rule number 2 is choose humility. So once you begin to take God seriously, you have to choose humility. Proverbs 11:2 says, when pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with humility comes wisdom. So how do you grow in humility? I mean, it's one of those words that, like grace and some of the other things, people throw the word around, but it's like, do you actually know how you make progress in that? Do you know what it is? And for years, I was like, just make me humble, God. I didn't know what to do with that, And, but again, a very humble and a very wise man that I learned from, Dallas Willard, who was here, he gave a very simple kind of 3-step process that he said he's been really helpful for him in learning wisdom. And as I put that into practice, it has been incredibly helpful for me too, and many others. He says 3 things, and they all start with the P. He says, never pretend, never presume, and never push. They're not on the screen, so you just have to listen and write those down. Never pretend, never presume, and never push. So what does that mean? So never pretend, what he's saying there is, guys, don't pretend that you're someone you're not. If you don't understand something, don't pretend that you do. If you don't have something figured out, don't pretend. Just be who you are. Look to grow in different areas of life, but don't pretend. You don't have to fake it till you make it. The only people that you ever really can fool when you fake it till you make it are the ones that don't actually know that thing. But the ones that do really know that you're just faking it. So you might as well just be who you are, so don't pretend. And the second one, don't presume. Don't presume. So don't presume that you ought to be treated a certain way or that you ought to have something like, well, I deserve that. Are you sure you deserve that? Or they ought to treat me. Do they know who I am? It's like, don't presume. Very often I've struggled with that too, where I think I'll get frustrated about something and I'll realize, you know what you're doing, Jeremy? You're just presuming. I mean, it'd be nice if they treated you that way, but you're not entitled to that. You're presuming you should be treated that way. And then the third, never push. Never push. We want to proactively move towards the things of God and move towards the things that are right. We want to stand up for those things. We want to really walk with God. But we want to let God do the pushing. We want to be convincing with things, but it's very easy, if you're not careful, to begin to move from the realm of looking to be encouraging and convincing to just being pushing and manipulating and coercing, and all with the thought of, it'll be for their good. And it's like, no. God's the one who does the pushing. You just choose to do what's right, but you don't push. And for me, time and time again, when I begin to find just pride and frustration like that begin to well up in me in different areas, I'll go back to those and go, am I pushing? Am I presuming? Am I pretending in this area? And usually it's one or a combination of those. But as you begin to put those into practice, you'll find over time you're growing in humility. And then the third rule is trusting God's perspective, not your own. Trusting God's perspective, not your own. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. Which begs the question that how do you know what God's perspective is? Do you kind of do that? My kids are in Peter Pan right now, so I've been thinking about that. They're in a Peter Pan play. Like, do you do the Peter Pan kind of advice and just think happy thoughts? Like, that's probably what God's thinking, just happy thoughts, and then we'll off fly and go to Neverland. Is that the way you kind of figure out God's perspective on things? Like, what's like the nicest thought I could think? That's probably God's thought. It's like, no, that's actually not how you do it. God's perspective on many areas of life is actually not intuitive, especially earlier on when we're getting to know God and walk through them, which is one of the reasons he had to reveal it to us. It's actually quite foreign to us. So to learn his perspective, we have to regularly begin to get in the scriptures, begin to read the Bible, begin to understand what is his perspective on life in different areas. And as we do that, as we humble ourselves, as we fear God and take him seriously, and we choose to trust his perspective and his ways, we begin to put into practice the things he's doing, and we begin to trust more of what he says rather than what our business professor or philosophy professor said about something on how life works. Instead, we say, well, actually, this is what God says. So I'm going to go with his direction. And as you do that, you'll find, one of the things you'll begin to find out is, sure enough, God was right. Who would have thought? Like, his ways actually work, And that doesn't mean life will be all easy. And sometimes God's ways, they're going to cost you in the short run. But it will always pay in the long run when you take his direction, his approach. And so that's the third rule. The fourth rule is this: do life with wise people. Do life with wise people. Proverbs 13:20 says, walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. So one of the things you want to begin to do is choose to intentionally do life with wise people. Now, if that wise person is also good looking and cool, that's a bonus. But honestly, if they're not the best good looking person and they're not the coolest person, but they're wise, you would be wise to get time with someone like that over they have all the same things in common and they do all the same things I do. And in fact, guys and girls, if there are wise people that you hang around that just got dark. There you go. If there's people you hang around and you think, well, I know they're not that wise, but we have so much in common, right? Think about that. We have so much in common. They do all the same things I do, but they're not wise. Do I need to connect the dots for you? Maybe you're not wise. Maybe that's something to think about. Just a thought. And then rule number 5, look to Jesus as your model for wisdom and ask for his help. Look to Jesus as your model for wisdom and ask for his help. I love this verse in 1 Corinthians 1, the second half of verse 24 and 25. It says, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. Now, does God have foolishness? No, but he's saying even if he did, it'd be better than the wisdom of humans. And the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. See, Jesus really is our ultimate source of wisdom, and he's our ultimate help in living a wise life. He's wiser than Solomon. He's the one that gave Solomon all of his wisdom. And he's more powerful and he's more helpful. And for those of you guys here tonight that have never actually begun a personal relationship with Jesus, have never decided that you wanted to trust him as your Lord and Savior, I would so encourage you to do that, because Jesus won't be much help to you if you just kind of keep him at the distance where you observe him and you just kind of see him as a good moral example or a good teacher, or someone you can learn some nice, pithy sayings from. I mean, that'll help you some, but because he is that. He is a good teacher. He is a good moral example, but he's so much more than that. He's our creator, and he's the king of the universe, and he invites us to step out of the kingdom of darkness and into his kingdom of light, where we can have a restored relationship with him, where we can have a restored relationship with our Heavenly Father, if we choose to place our full confidence in him, to be both the payment for our sin and shame, and to be the one who is the Lord of our life. And what that really means to be the Lord of life, meaning you want to center and orient your whole life around him and knowing him and following him. And if you do this, I can rest assured you will not regret that decision, because he's completely trustworthy and he loves us and he has our best interest at heart. And there is no one, if you're going to follow someone, again, another Dallas Willard thing, like people used to ask him, like, Dallas, you're this incredibly brilliant philosopher and you're a great thinker. You're kind of like a modern day C.S. Lewis. Like, why do you follow Jesus? And he said, my answer to them was always the same. Who else did you have in mind? Who else did you have in mind? You're going to follow someone, whether it's yourself or someone else. And he wasn't being, facetious about it. He'd really ask, like, do you have someone else in mind that you would stack up that might be better to follow than Jesus? Because if so, I'd love to hear it. And they didn't, And so, he said some students to say to him, like, well, I don't follow anyone. I follow myself. And he said, and I congratulated them. I say, well, that's great. I'm glad. The problem is I can't follow myself. I have too many issues. But I'm glad that your life's going well enough that you can follow yourself. That's great. Good job. Knowing, of course, that was not going to go well for them. Now, for those of you that were raised by godly, wise parents, you can attest to the fact that some of the things we're talking about tonight are true. You're like, yeah, I've seen that played out. But it's also true that those of you that were raised by parents that kind of more so walked on the path of foolishness, albeit they loved you, but they mainly made a decision along the path of foolishness, you can also attest to the things that I talked about tonight are true, because you have the scars to show for that. But that doesn't have to be your path. By God's grace, you can actually choose to get on a different path. You can choose to step off the path of foolishness onto the path of wisdom. And for those of you that were raised by wise and godly parents, you are not guaranteed to stay on the path of wisdom. You're going to have to make the decision for yourself that I am going to choose to step on the path of wisdom. I may have been raised on the path of wisdom, but if I do not choose to step on the path of wisdom, I will not stay on it. That's not how it works. But just imagine for a second. Imagine if you skip the path of fools and follow wisdom's rules, how much better your life would be and the lives of those around you that you have a ripple effect on. I'm at the age now that I am aware of how my actions affect me, but I'm even more keenly aware of how my actions affect the people around me. I have a wife and 3 kids and one on the way, and I have so many close relationships with the staff and students and people at church and family that I'm very much keenly aware that when I'm walking on the path of wisdom, people around me are blessed. But I'm also very keenly aware of the opposite, that when I'm walking on the path of a fool, people around me suffer. And just think how much better your relationships and your health and your finances and your impact in the world and your future in general, how much better that would be if you walked according to wisdom's rules. Think about how much better the lives of those around you would be because of your choices. So, in wrapping up tonight, I want to close the message really the same way that Jesus closed his most famous message of all time, what people call the Sermon on the Mount. Because see, what Jesus didn't say after giving arguably the most profound and wise utterances any human voice has ever spoken when he gave that famous message, and when he talked about what life in the kingdom is like and how we can live in that, what he didn't say was something like this, guys, don't worry about any of this stuff. Because after all, my grace will handle it all. You don't have to really do any of this. But I said these things in case, you want to level up before you get to heaven. These are some good suggestions. But after all, I know I told you about what life in the kingdom looks like and things to watch out for, but guys, my grace is sufficient. You're fine. Just go about doing whatever you're doing. It's fine. No, he didn't say that. He didn't say that because he was keenly aware that without his grace and help, he was aware that without his grace and help, his listening audience couldn't do anything. Yes, he was aware of that. But he was also aware that he was not going to force anyone that heard what he was saying to put into practice the things that he was saying. That was going to be a choice they'd have to make for themselves. And he was also aware that he didn't want people to walk away from, again, the most profound, amazing piece of wisdom ever shared on this earth, the Sermon on the Mount. He didn't want people walking away from that thinking, hey, I took notes on the Sermon on the Mount in my challenge notebook. I took them on my phone, and so I'm basically going to be able to experience the blessing of everything that Jesus shared. No, he knew better than that, and he didn't want people to think that. And so he closed the most wisdom-packed sermon ever given with these words. He says, Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice, not writes them down, not sings a song about them, not posts them on Instagram, but puts them into practice, is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down and the streams rose and the wind blew and beat against that house, and yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. And then a contrast. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice. I got the t-shirt. I was there, but does not put them into practice is like a foolish man. That seems harsh, Jesus. Yeah, well, you're Jesus. So, could say that. It's like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down and the stream rose and the winds blew and beat against the house and it fell with a great crash. Men and women, you do not want to be a fool. I don't think anyone here does. Again, you didn't come into this day thinking, I think today I'll be a fool. None of us think that way. None of us want to ruin our lives. But to choose the path of wisdom and to put in practice the things you hear, and you have to lean in to the community of the people around you that love you. You have to lean into what Jesus is saying here. To skip the path of fools, you must follow wisdom's rules. That is the way that you're really going to stay off the path for a fool and stay on the path for wisdom. You can do it, but it's more than just head knowledge. We actually have to put these things into practice. So let me pray for us, and we'll invite the band back up. Father, I'm so grateful you gave Solomon so much wisdom and that you put it on his heart to write the things that he wrote. Because I don't know about the rest of the people in this room, but I am fairly simple and I need a lot of help and guidance. So thank you, God, for giving us the whole scriptures and your life in Jesus, but also the book of Proverbs. I pray that even in just this poor demonstration of some of the things in Proverbs I talked about tonight, God, that this would just encourage and spur on the minds and the creativity and the hearts of people here to want to begin to dive into Proverbs, want to begin to learn from incredibly wise people before us that wrote Proverbs. And God, that you would give them insight and wisdom. You say in James that if we lack wisdom, we can ask for it. I said, would you even give us just the wisdom to even understand the Proverbs, and then give us the courage and the character to begin to put into practice? And I pray, God, that we would really learn to walk with the wise, and we learn to really fear you and be humble, that we learn to really trust you, and we learn to really follow you in everything you're saying. And then we really reap the benefits that we talked about tonight. And God, would you please help us to be self-aware that if some of those things have tendencies of the foolishness are really part of the way we live, that we would just be honest with ourselves, and our friends would be honest with us, and we'd be honest with our friends, and we'd just begin to get some help and make some progress on that we wouldn't keep going down the path thinking we are going to be the exception to the rule. But God, I pray that we really walk in wisdom. Thank you for modeling it. Thanks for being patient with us and walking with us through that. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.